Hey everybody, I want to talk about Pauline theology and how it completely contradicts the law of Moses and the Torah. And people want to argue with this, but really seriously, why would God command things like the Sabbath forever? God didn't command the Sabbath until a Messiah came and died for our sins. God commanded the Sabbath forever. You know what I mean? And Paul completely contradicts these kinds of commandments. The Passover, too. The Passover was forever. It wasn't just for a little while until Jesus came and was the end of the law. The Passover was forever. Likewise with the circumcision, that was an everlasting covenant. You got to just check this stuff out. And if you don't believe that the law was forever, well, what does 2 Kings chapter 17 verse 37 say? It says, "And the statutes, the ordinances, the law, and the commandment which he wrote for you, you shall be careful to observe forever. You shall not fear other gods." Okay? So just think about this stuff, and that's a massive contradiction. If you're ever looking for a contradiction in the Bible or wondered if there was one, this, in my opinion, is quite possibly the biggest contradiction in the Bible. Where Paul says you're not under the law, and that Jews aren't under the law. Gentiles were never under the law. God did not make a covenant. Yahweh did not make a covenant with the Gentiles, so they're not. But the Jews, Israel, God did make an everlasting covenant with Israel. So for Paul to come around and make this claim that, oh, you're not under the law, but and that Christ is the end of the law for righteousness, what a bunch of nonsense. Why would you believe that? You believe it because your pastor told you it's true, because it's the church's tradition, it's the sacred tradition of the church. Why don't you think logically and rationally and compare these things and think for yourself? I do think that it is possible to disprove the letters of Paul just because it tries to use the Old Testament. It tries to use the Tanakh as its foundation. I think it fails. You know what I mean? Why would God command things like that forever? There's a ton of ordinances and laws in the Torah that were forever. So to say that Christ is the end of the law for righteousness, that seems like complete nonsense and a blatant contradiction. That's a lot bigger of a contradiction than squabbling over some number that they got wrong. That does prove a point. But I mean, this is a blatant, all-out contradiction. And like I said, 2 Kings chapter 17 verse 37. And the statutes, the ordinances, the law, and the commandment which he wrote for you, you shall be careful to observe forever. Okay. So that's just something to think about. I would just, if you're, just think about this stuff, turn away from Pauline theology, and really think about what you believe. And, I have typically been a kind of a fan of the Synoptic Gospels because that's a Jewish Messiah. He talks about, if you want to enter into life, keep the commandments and not, it's easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one jot or tittle of the law to fail, and he says things like that. So the Synoptic Jesus of the Synoptic Gospels is Torah observant and preaches keeping the Torah. So, that's just something to think about. So, but, versus the Gospel of John's Jesus, which is very kind of different, and preaches, that the Gospel of John teaches, just believe in Jesus, and that's all you have to do, So think about this stuff, and how these statutes and ordinances, were everlasting. The covenant was with Israel. The covenant of the law was everlasting. It wasn't for a little while. Now, God never made a covenant with Gentiles, you see. This was a covenant with Israel, not with Gentiles. So if you think that you as a Gentile need to keep the law, if you're a believer, then it's like, well, you'd have to ask, well, God never made a covenant with the Gentiles. So anyway, these are some good reasons to pray to God for wisdom that is logical and rational. So that you can understand these things and eliminate things that are false or very likely to be false. So just think about this stuff and don't try to come up with extravagant excuses, that you have to go to great lengths to try to prove, I don't think that's the answer. Just read it plainly for what it says. That these things, these commandments were forever. They were not for a little while until a Messiah came. So just pray to God for wisdom, logical wisdom, and read this stuff for yourself and investigate it for yourself. Anyway, you have a good day.